My name is Stacy Rumsey. I'm 44 years old. And 14 months before my father died, my stepmother, Roseanne, sat down with his lawyer, told him I hadn't contacted my father in 11 years, and let that man write her lie into the will as the reason his daughter was getting nothing. I found out in a conference room in Bellmore, Indiana, on a Tuesday afternoon, with a pen already in my hand. I'd driven there to sign. 5 of us around that table. The estate's attorney, his notary, Roseanne, her son Chad, and me. The release was 1 page with 2 lines for my name, and I had the pen down on the paper when Roseanne folded her hands and said it sweetly, the way she says everything, loud enough for the notary to hear. "Honey, don't make a face about it." He left it to the ones who showed up. The room did the thing rooms do. Nobody looked at anybody, and I set the pen down on top of the release, and I reached into my coat for the 1 piece of paper I'd told my husband I probably wouldn't need. Not one person in that room had any idea what was folded up in my coat. It wasn't a will, or a deed, or anything a lawyer would call an instrument. I was holding a form letter from the United States Postal Service, dated March of 2015, that my father had folded into thirds and kept in a coffee can on top of his refrigerator for 11 years. And I wasn't going to read it to them. I was going to ask the attorney to turn it over. Welcome back to Porch Stories, where the things that never arrived finally get read out loud. If you've ever sent something into a silence and spent years deciding what the silence meant about you, sit down and stay a while. This one's yours. Tell me in the comments what you stopped sending and when you stopped, and hit subscribe. Because to understand what was on the back of that letter, you have to go all the way back to a can on a refrigerator and a man who wrote things down so he wouldn't have to ask twice. Let's go back. I'm a veterinary technician at Two Rivers Animal Clinic, which is a mixed practice, which means half my week is cats in carriers and the other half is standing in a wet barn at 6 in the morning with my arm inside a cow. It's not a glamorous living. I've been doing it 19 years, and I'm good at exactly one thing, which is holding something that's terrified without squeezing it. That's the whole job. Everything else is technique. My husband's name is Brock. He drives a propane truck out of the Waldron yard, and in the winter he's gone before I'm awake and home smelling like cold metal. He's 50% quieter than any man I've ever met. When something is wrong in our house, he doesn't ask about it. He starts fixing something adjacent, the disposal, the storm door, the truck's rear brake light, and he stays in the room until you talk. He's done that to me for 21 years, and I've never once beaten it. Our son Elliot is 16. He's all forearms and opinions. He's learning to drive Brock's old stick, and he's gotten to the stage where he can start on a hill without praying out loud, and he plays trombone badly and with total confidence, which I find to be an excellent quality in a person. He calls me by my first name when he's teasing me. He calls me Mom when he wants something, and also when he's scared, and I've learned to hear the difference. At the clinic, there's Raquel, who's 29, and takes my Thursdays when I need them, and has never once asked why. She keeps butterscotch candies in the drawer with the suture kits, which is against about 4 rules. And there's Dr. Hasty, who owns the place, and who has, in 9 years, never done anything fast in his life. He'll stand over a bad X-ray with his hands in his pockets for 4 full minutes before he says a word. I used to think it was a nervous thing. It's not. He's deciding what he's actually sure of. I've stolen more from that man than he knows. That's my life. It's small, and it's mine, and I built it. And I need you to see it standing there in one piece before I hand you the part that was missing out of the middle of it for 11 years. My father was Orland Hepler. He was 74 when he died, and he'd lived his whole life inside the same 9 miles. He was a maintenance man for the Bellmore School Corporation for 31 years, which meant he owned a ring of keys the size of a cantaloupe, and every furnace in that town knew him personally. He wasn't a talker, he was a writer-downer. He carried a carpenter's pencil in his shirt pocket, and he wrote things on whatever was closest the back of a receipt, the edge of a church bulletin, his own hand. He did it because he'd been embarrassed once as a young man for asking the same question twice, and he decided he was never going to be embarrassed like that again. My mother was Christine. She died when I was 12, and I don't have as much of her as I want. I have that she sang in the car, and only in the car, and that she pronounced my name like it had 3 syllables when she was proud of me. My dad didn't do grief out loud. What he did instead was keep the two of us on a schedule, because a schedule is a thing a man can hold. And on top of our refrigerator there was a blue coffee can with a plastic lid, and it was called the later can. Here's how it worked. When I asked for something we couldn't do, a trip to the water park in Rossville, a certain pair of boots, a horse. I asked for a horse for 2 solid years. He didn't say no. He'd say, "That's a later." And he'd take the carpenter's pencil out of his pocket and write it on a scrap and drop it in the can. And then in March, around my birthday, he'd take the can down and set it on the kitchen table, and we'd pull one out, just one. And whatever it said, we did it. Even if it was stupid. Even if it was out of season. I got the water park. I never got the horse. I got a Saturday when I was 15, where the scrap said, "Drive to the ocean," and we couldn't do that, obviously. So we drove 4 hours to Lake Michigan and stood in the wind and ate gas station sandwiches, and he let me drive part of the way home on the county roads with nobody coming. That can is the whole architecture of the man. He couldn't say, "I love you." He could write down what you wanted and keep it where he could see it. He also had a dog, later on. A blue heeler named Buckshot, who was already old when I met him, and who would not get out of the truck bed at my clinic under any circumstances. Every visit, my father lifted 70 pounds of stiff dog down out of that truck and carried him through my door like a rolled rug. And Buckshot would look at me over his shoulder with an expression of total betrayal. And my dad would say, "He don't hold it against you long." 2 years of that. Every 3 months. That's the part that gets me now. Those visits were on his calendar. He came to the place I worked because it was the place I worked. Roseanne came into it in 2013. She was a widow from over in Waldron, and she and my dad met at a funeral dinner at Pleasant Grove, which is exactly the kind of sentence that tells you everything about a place. I want to be fair here, because the version where she walked in a villain isn't true, and it isn't useful. She was good to him. She got him to a doctor. She got the gutters done. She had him eating something besides sandwiches for the first time since my mother. And she filled a house that had been quiet for 21 years with a whole church's worth of noise casseroles. Ladies in the kitchen, a birthday party for a man who hadn't had one since Ford was president. She was warm to me too, at first, and the warmth wasn't fake. That's what I've had the hardest time explaining to people. It wasn't a performance she dropped later. She was a genuinely warm woman with one belief that ran under everything like a waterline. Roseanne drove to a nursing home in Waldron for 9 years. Her own mother, Tuesdays and Fridays and most Sundays, 9 years, hip to Alzheimer's to the end. And she had a sister in Arizona who sent cards. Nice cards, thoughtful ones, birthdays and Easter, and who flew in twice in 9 years. And at the funeral, it was the sister who gave the eulogy, and the room cried, and afterward a woman Roseanne had known her whole life took the sister's hands and said what a devoted daughter she'd been. Roseanne told me that story herself, at my own kitchen table, in 2014. She wasn't bitter when she told it. She was instructive. She patted the table twice, and she said the thing she'd say 100 more times, and she always said it like a blessing, with her hands warm on the sides of your face if she could reach you. Showing up is the whole of it, honey. The rest is just paper. I remember agreeing with her. I remember thinking it was wise. No sentence anybody ever said to me has taken up more of my head than that one, and here's where I've landed. She wasn't lying, and she wasn't wrong. She had watched a woman get credit for love she hadn't spent, and it had wrecked something in her, and she'd come out of it with a rule. The trouble with a rule like that is what it lets you do to people who are far away. Now, the estrangement. Everybody in Bellmore knows the story. I've had it repeated back to me by people who were not there. The story is that in the fall of 2015, there was a blow-up at my dad's house over the farm ground, 9.5 acres. My grandfather left him, rented out to a neighbor, worth something to a developer someday, and nothing to anybody in the meantime, and that Orland's daughter said some things she couldn't take back, and left, and never came back, and never called, and never wrote. Here's what actually happened, and it's so much smaller than the story that it embarrasses me. Roseanne wanted the ground put in both their names. She had a reason, and it was a good one. Her first husband died without her name on anything, and his brother took the house out from under her in 6 months. And she was 58 years old with a boy in community college, and she has never in her life gotten over it. She wasn't wrong to want it. Here's the scene. It was a Sunday in October, and there was a pot roast, and she brought it up over the pot roast, the way you bring up a thing you've rehearsed lightly, like it just occurred to you, with the serving spoon still in your hand. She said it'd be simpler for taxes. She said Ted Fowler down the road had done the same thing with his, and it saved his kids a world of trouble. And my dad said, well, sure, because that's what he said to everything. And then he looked at me, because he always looked at me when he'd said yes to something, and that look was the closest thing to a question the man had. I said out loud, in my father's kitchen, that I thought he should talk to somebody first, not a lawyer. I didn't say, lawyer. I said, talk to somebody, Dad. That was the whole thing. That's the sentence. And Roseanne's face did something I'd never seen on it. It didn't get angry. It got finished, the way a face does when a long-standing suspicion gets its confirmation. And she set the spoon down and said, real quiet, well, there it is. And I said, there's what? And I said it wrong. I said it the way you say it when you want to fight. Because by then, I did, and she said, you've been waiting on that ground since the day I walked in this house. Which wasn't true. And here's the thing about a sentence that isn't true. You can't disprove it, and you can only get louder. So I got louder. I said some things about 13 years and 51 years, and who'd sat in that kitchen when there was nobody in it. And she went and got her coat, and my dad stood in the middle of his own kitchen with his hands out like a man on ice, and he said, Stace, don't. He said it to me, not to her. And I've turned that over about 9,000 times, and I think what he meant was, don't go. And what I heard was, don't say that. And that's the whole failure right there in 3 words. I left. I was 33, and I was angry, and I left. I called 4 days later, and Roseanne answered and said he was napping. I called 8 days after that, and she said the line was bad and hung up. I sent a card at Thanksgiving. And then it just kept being like that. Nobody declared anything. There was no door slammed and no letter of excommunication. There was a woman who answered the phone and a man who was always napping. And after a while, I stopped calling and started writing, because writing you can do without anybody's permission. I wrote him 41 letters in 11 years. I know it's 41 because I'm the kind of woman who writes the date on the back of the envelope before she seals it, which I got from him, 4 or 5 a year, his birthday in August, Christmas. My birthday in March, which was our thing, the can and the scrap, and I'd write him what I'd have pulled out of it that year. I sent a photo of Elliot in his marching uniform. I sent him a copy of Buckshot's last X-ray, the one with the mass on it, because Dr. Hasty read it, and I wanted my dad to see that his dog's ribs were on a light box in the building where his daughter worked. I wrote the way you write to a man who doesn't talk, which is that you don't ask him anything. You just hand him things. Here's one, near the front, from the spring of 2016. And I can quote it because I've got it in front of me. Dad, the Rutherford's mare foaled Tuesday, and Dr. Hasty let me do the whole thing and only stood there. Elliot lost a tooth in an apple. It rained 4 inches out here, and I thought about your basement. Tell Buckshot, I said, he's a coward. Stacy, that's it. That's a letter. 60 words and no accusation in it anywhere, and no question he'd have had to answer, because I knew he wouldn't, and I didn't want to make him fail at something. I never once got an answer. And here's the part I have to say plainly, because I spent 11 years not saying it. After about year 3, I stopped writing letters to my father and started writing letters at him. There's a difference, and he'd have heard it. They got shorter. There's one in there, I've read them all now, which we'll get to, where I wrote 4 sentences about the weather and signed it Stacy like I was returning a form. I built a story to live inside, because you have to live inside something. The story was, he chose her, and he's a grown man, and he knows my address. That story cost me 11 years, and it was the only thing I had. And I want to say to anybody out there running on a story like that you were the one who got left, that they know where you are, that the ball is in their court. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I'm going to tell you I was, and that I had every reason to believe it, and that the reasons were manufactured. If you've ever built a whole life around what somebody's silence must have meant, put it in the comments how many years you gave it before you quit. I go through them. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because the first crack in my story was a little green card that came back with a signature on it I couldn't read. I went out there one time in those 11 years, and I need to tell you about it, because it's the 20 minutes the whole rest of my life turns on, and I didn't know it while it was happening. It was 2 days after Christmas, 2018. Elliot was 9, and I had him in the back seat with a tin of my mother's date bars that I'd made from the recipe card, badly. And I hadn't called ahead because I'd learned what calling ahead got me. Roseanne came out on the porch, and she was, I have to keep saying this, she was nice. She said, "Well, look who it is," and she hugged me, and she said he was having a decent morning, and she'd bring him out because the house was a wreck, which it was not. That house has never been a wreck a day in its life. And she brought him out onto the porch in his coat with a blanket over his knees, in December, in Indiana. And she stood in the doorway the entire time with her arms folded against the cold, and we had 20 minutes. He was so glad to see Elliot. He asked him about school, and he asked him twice, and Elliot answered both times, God bless him, like it was a new question. He got the boy to come stand next to him, and he put his hand flat on the top of his head, which is a thing he used to do to me, and he said, "You got tall." And when we were leaving, I was already down the steps with the empty tin, he said it. He said it in front of her, with her right there in the doorway. He said, "You could write once in a while." I got in my car and I drove out of that driveway with my ears roaring, and I made it about 4 miles before I had to pull over on County Road 600 and cry so hard that my 9-year-old asked me if we were going to be okay, because I'd written him 11 letters by then. 11. And he'd sat there on that porch, wrapped in a blanket, and said the one thing that proved he hadn't read a single word. I took it as a slap. Of course I took it as a slap. What else is that? A man tells his daughter she doesn't write, and his daughter is holding the postmarks. So I drove home, and I put the tin in the sink, and I told Brock I was done. And for about 8 months, I was. And that's the last time I saw my father's face. You already know what I know now. He wasn't scolding me. He was asking me. He was a man who had gotten nothing in the mail for 3 years, and he was telling his daughter, in the only volume he had, with his wife standing in the doorway 6 feet away, that his mailbox was empty. That was him reaching. 14 months ago, I sat at my kitchen table and figured that out in about 1 second, and it is the single worst second I have ever had. Anyway, 2022. In 2022, I did something that I'm going to describe honestly, which is that I did it out of spite and not out of suspicion. I sent a letter certified, return receipt requested, $8.45 at the counter in Bellmore. The clerk asked me if I wanted the electronic tracking or the little green card that comes back in the mail, and I said, the card, because I wanted the physical thing. I wanted proof, and what I thought I was proving was that he'd gotten it and hadn't answered. I wanted to hold that. That's the woman I was that year. The card came back 11 days later, signed, and the signature was a loop with a hook on the end of it, and I stood in my driveway and turned it over twice and could not make it into my father's name. My father printed. He printed everything in small block capitals, because 31 years of work orders will do that to a man's hand. That signature was cursive, and it had a tall, confident loop, and it was not his. And do you know what I decided? I decided it was the mail carrier. I stood there, and I told myself carriers sign for stuff all the time on a rural route, And I put the card in the junk drawer in my kitchen, and I let 4 years go by without picking it back up. I've had to sit with why. Here's the closest I can get. If the signature wasn't his, then my whole story fell over. Then he wasn't ignoring me. Then something else was happening. Then 11 years of my anger had been aimed at a man who might not have known, and if that was true, I had to go do something about it. And doing something meant driving back to that house and standing in front of Roseanne, and I couldn't. So I filed it under mail carrier, and I shut the drawer. That's not a story about a clever woman. That's a story about how much easier it is to be wronged than to be wrong. There's one more thing in those 11 years, and it's the worst one. In the spring of 2023, my dad had a stroke, a small one. He was in the hospital in Waldron for 6 days, and he came home with a walker and a slur that mostly cleared up. I found out about it in October of that year from a woman at the co-op who assumed I knew. I want to be careful here, because I know how that sounds, and I know what you do. I know because I know what I did. I drove out there. I got in my car in the co-op parking lot and drove out the county road and pulled into the driveway. And Roseanne came out on the porch and pulled the door shut behind her and stood on the top step. She was kind. She was so kind. She said he'd tired easy now, and that a surprise wasn't good for him, and that she'd tell him I stopped, and she'd have him call. And she said, and this is the sentence, this is the one that kept me in my car, she said. He asks about you, sweetheart. And she wasn't lying. That's what I found out later. He did ask about me. He asked about me constantly. I sat in that driveway with the engine running, and I looked at the house I grew up in, and I did the arithmetic that every estranged person does, which is, how much humiliation is this worth? And I backed out. That's mine. She didn't make me do that. I'm 44 years old, and I turned around in my own father's driveway because a woman on the porch was pleasant to me. And there's no letter, and no notice, and no piece of paper anywhere in this story that gets that back. He died on a Tuesday in October, 2 years later. He was 74. I found out 4 days after the funeral, from Buford Gaddy. Buford's 79, and he farms the ground east of my dad's place, and he has burned the same brush pile on the same Saturday in March for as long as I've been alive. He keeps a folding lawn chair in the bed of his truck at all times. For no reason anybody's ever established, he called my clinic. Not my cell, he didn't have it. He called the front desk at Two Rivers and asked for the girl that used to be Orland's, and Raquel handed me the phone with a face on her I'll never forget. He said, Stacy, I don't know how to ask this. Did you not want to come? I said, Buford, come where? There was a long quiet on that line. Then he said, "Aw, hell, honey." And I heard him sit down. Orland Hepler had a funeral at Pleasant Grove on a Saturday, and Buford said the church was full, and my name was not in the obituary, not misprinted, not listed under survivors, absent. Roseanne had written it herself, and it said he was survived by his wife and by his son, Chad Boychuk, who is 46, and who my father knew for 13 years, and who calls him Orland. I don't remember the rest of that shift. Raquel does. She says I finished a dental. I have no memory of it at all. 9 days later, I got a phone call from a paralegal named Camila with an 11-word script telling me that the estate of Orland Hepler was open, and I was entitled to notice, and would I be able to come to the office of Byron Kilgore in Bellmore. I want to give Byron Kilgore his due, because he ended up mattering. He's maybe 65, a country lawyer in a town of 4,000, and the first thing he does in a meeting is put a paper cup of water in front of every person at the table with his own hands. And he doesn't sit down until everybody else is sitting. He's not warm. He's careful. He's the kind of man who has been in a room where somebody found out something terrible and has decided to always have water on the table. He read the will out loud because I asked him to. The house and the 9.5 acres and everything in the house to Roseanne. Everything. And then he got to the part I'd come for without knowing it. The will had a recital in it. That's the word for it, he told me later. a sentence a testator puts in to explain himself. It said, "I have intentionally made no provision for my daughter, Stacy Rumsey, who has had no contact with me since 2015. He read it in a level voice, and then he stopped and he looked at me, and to his credit, he didn't look away. I said, "Can I see the date on that?" The will was signed 14 months before he died, 8 months after I turned around in his driveway. I did what you'd do. I went and paid a lawyer $250 for 40 minutes in Waldron, and I asked her whether I could fight it. She was good. She was fast, and she was honest, and she told me 3 things. 1. I had 3 months from the day it went to probate to file a contest, and about 7 weeks of that were already gone. 2. To win it, I'd have to prove undue influence or that he wasn't competent, and a stroke 2.5 years earlier that he recovered from is not a case, and my stepmother answered the phone is not a case, and it would cost me between $15,000 and $40,000 to find out. 3, and she said this gently, with her pen down, that even if I won, the ground was worth what it was worth, and a jury in that county was going to hear a woman who took care of a man for 13 years and a daughter who wasn't at the funeral. I said, "I wasn't told about the funeral." And she said, "I believe you. Can you prove it?" So I quit. That's the honest word for it, and I'd rather use it than the polite ones. I didn't make peace, and I didn't rise above anything. I quit. And everything I did after that only makes sense if you know I'd already stopped fighting for the house. I drove home and I told Brock I was going to sign whatever they put in front of me. And he didn't say anything. He went out and put a new bulb in the light over the back door, which had been out since August, and he stayed out there a long time, and when he came in, I was crying at the sink, and he stood there with me until I stopped. There was one more thing before the office, and it's the hinge of the whole story, so let me put it down carefully. Kilgore arranged for me to have 20 minutes in the house to take a keepsake. Roseanne agreed to it. Chad stood in the doorway of the kitchen the entire time with his arms crossed, which I think he thought was subtle. The house was already mostly gone. There'd been an estate sale company through, I found out later. They'd written a check for $3,140 for the contents of a house a family lived in for 51 years. The couch was gone. The kitchen table was gone. My mother's good dishes were gone. But the refrigerator was still there, and on top of it, where it had been my entire life, was a blue coffee can with a plastic lid. I took it down and Chad said, "That's not worth anything." And I said, "I know." That's all either of us said. I walked out with a coffee can under my arm, past a woman standing at her own front door with her hands folded, and she said, "Drive safe, honey," and she meant it. And that's the thing about her I still can't get around. I did not open it for 3 weeks. I want you to understand that I wasn't investigating. There was nothing to investigate. I'd signed nothing yet, but I'd decided to sign, and the can was on top of my own refrigerator for 21 days, because every time I looked at it, my chest closed up. Brock moved it once to get at the cereal and put it back exactly where it was, and never mentioned it. I opened it on a Thursday at 11 at night with the house asleep. The scraps were in there. Not all of them, but a lot of them. 30 years of them. In his printing, in Carpenter's pencil, on receipts and bulletin corners, and one on the back of a school bus inspection tag, Water Park. Boots W, Fringe, Horse No, Drive to the Ocean. I went through them one at a time and laid them out on the table in rows like a hand of solitaire, and about halfway through I understood I was reading 2 different men. There's 30 years of a young father writing down a kid's wants, and then there's a gap, and then there's a widower in his 60s and 70s writing down his own. Because he kept using it. After I was gone, he kept using it, and I didn't know that. And it's the reason I had to put my head down on the table for a while. Take the girl to the dog place, which is what he called my clinic, and which he wrote after the last time he could drive there. Get the truck cleaned out, the good way. Find out about that boy's band. And one, on the back of a pharmacy receipt, in blocks that had already started to come apart. Ask her what I did. I've read that one more times than is good for me. He didn't write times Why doesn't she call? He didn't write anything about her at all. He wrote it as a thing he'd done, and he put it in the can with the rest of the laters, which means that in his head, it was still an item, still open, still something the two of us were going to get to on a March 2nd. And underneath all of that, folded in thirds, were 4 letters from the United States Postal Service. They're form letters. I'd never seen one before, and I'd bet most of you haven't either. When somebody files a change of address, the Postal Service mails a plain letter to the old address that says, essentially, "We've received a request to forward mail for this person, and if you didn't request it, here's who to call." It's a fraud check. It goes to the address being left behind. 4 of them, dated March of 2015, then 2016, then 2019, then 2022. Each one confirming a forwarding order for mail addressed to Orland Hepler, sent onward to a post office box in Waldron. The smallest box they rent, paid 6 months at a time. I sat there and did the thing where your ears ring. First-class forwarding runs a year. That's why there are 4 of them, and not one the order lapsed and got filed again, and lapsed and got filed again. And in the years between, it didn't need to be filed, because the mailbox is at the road, 140 yards from that house down a gravel drive, and after his hip went bad, my father did not walk to the road. Somebody brought the mail up. Somebody brought the mail up for 11 years. That's it. That's the whole machine. There's no forgery in this story, and no hacking and no hidden camera. There's a form you can fill out at any post office counter, and 140 yards of gravel. And then I turned the first one over. He'd used the back of it. Of course he had. It was blank paper in a can full of scraps, and he was a man who wrote things down. At the top, in ink, in his blocks, "Asked Roseanne says it's the church mail," and a date, 4 days after the letter. He asked her. He got a letter from the government that said somebody was moving his mail, and he walked into his own kitchen and asked his wife, and she told him something. And he wrote down what she told him so he wouldn't have to ask her twice, and then he let it go. Because why on earth wouldn't he? I sat there a while with that. Because I know what that is. That's not a man being fooled. That's a man being answered. He asked a direct question in his own kitchen, and he got a direct answer from the person he'd decided to trust with the rest of his life. And then he did the responsible thing, which was write it down so he wouldn't pester her about it again. He was protecting her from being asked twice. That's what that line is. And down the rest of that page, in pencil, in a column, spaced out over years, in handwriting that gets worse as it goes down, 7 lines. Same shape every time, in his block printing. The date written the short way he wrote dates on a work order. Here they are, the way they read out loud. March 2nd. Nothing. March 2nd. Nothing. March 2nd. Nothing again. March 2nd. Nothing. March 2nd. Nothing again. March 2nd. Still nothing. March 2nd. That last one is from after the stroke, and there's no word after it. He got the date down, and the pencil just stops. I've held that page up to the window more than once looking for something underneath it, and there's nothing underneath it. He got as far as the day. My birthday is March 2nd. That was our day. The can came down off the refrigerator on March 2nd. He kept a tally, on the back of the piece of paper that explained exactly what had happened to him, which he could not read because he had already been told what it said. And the third line down the one that says nothing again is from March of 2018, 9 months before he sat on that porch in a blanket with his hand on my son's head and told me I could write once in a while. He wasn't scolding me on that porch. He'd been counting for 3 years, and I was standing right there, and he asked me the only way a man like that can ask, in front of a witness, with the person who'd have to hear it standing 6 feet behind him in the doorway. That was not a complaint. That was a man throwing something as far as he could throw it. I drove 4 miles and pulled over and cried because he'd insulted me. Now, here's what I did, and, more importantly, what I didn't. I didn't call the Postal Inspection Service, and I'd have been within my rights. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't take a picture of that page and put it in the family group chat at midnight with the words, "Still think I moved on," and "God, as my witness, I wrote that message. I wrote it twice." I didn't do it because I finally understood what I actually wanted, and it wasn't the house. I did not want the 9.5 acres. I've never wanted them. What I wanted was that one sentence off my father's last page. I wanted it on the record somewhere that the reason given for cutting me out was a thing that had been done to him, and that he'd have been the first person in that county to say so if anybody had let him. That's a small want. It's worth about $0. My lawyer in Waldron told me straight out that no court on earth was going to convene to edit a sentence. She was right. So I called Byron Kilgore's office, and I told Camila I'd sign the release, and could I please do it in person, in front of everybody, because I had one thing I wanted to say to my stepmother, and I wasn't going to say it over a phone. They set it for a Tuesday at 2. Let me stop and give Roseanne what's hers, because a story where she's just a monster is a story that teaches nobody anything, including me. She spent 9 years driving to Waldron for a woman who at the end didn't know her name. She earned every hour of that and got a thank you card from Arizona for it. She held my father's hand in an emergency room at 2 in the morning while I was 40 minutes away in my own bed, asleep because I didn't know. She bathed him after the stroke. She was the one who found him. Those are facts, and I'll say them out loud in any room in that county. And she looked at a can of scraps on a refrigerator and at a stack of envelopes with my handwriting on them, and she made a judgment, and I think she genuinely believed it was a merciful one, that a man is better off with the person who is in the chair than with the person who is in the mail. All of that is true. It stops at the gravel drive. Whatever her sister took from her in 1990 whatever. My father is the one who sat in that kitchen writing nothing under nothing in a hand that got worse every year. You don't get to charge him for it. The conference room at Kilgore's is nothing. 8 chairs, a laminate table, a window unit that cycles. Byron put the paper cups of water down, one in front of each of us, with his own hands. He didn't sit until we all had. Camila sat at the corner with the notary stamp and a roll of those little red signature flags, and she peels them off one at a time and says sorry every time she reaches across a person, and she must have said sorry 6 times that afternoon. Roseanne was already there when I came in her good navy cardigan, the one she keeps for funerals and school programs. She stood up and hugged me. I let her. Chad took the window and crossed his arms and stayed that way, which I think he thought was subtle. Byron went through it the way you'd expect. The release, what it gives up, that I was signing away my right to contest, that he'd advised me to have my own counsel and I'd declined in writing. He asked me twice if I understood. I said I did both times. And I picked up the pen and I put it on the paper, and Roseanne folded her hands and said, "Warm as anything. Honey, don't make a face about it." He left it to the ones who showed up. I want to be plain about this next part, because it's the only thing in this whole story I'd defend to anybody. Nobody trapped her. She said that at her own attorney's table on a Tuesday she'd agreed to, with a notary 6 feet away, unprompted, while I was in the act of giving her everything she wanted. I hadn't said one word to her since the hug. All I'd done was not warn her. I set the pen down on top of the release. I took the letter out of my coat. It was folded in thirds, the way he'd kept it, and it was soft at the creases from 11 years in a can. And I slid it across that laminate table face down, and I said, "Mr. Kilgore, would you turn that over and read the back of it, please?" Out loud. "That's my father's handwriting." Roseanne said, "What is that?" Byron picked it up. He read the front first, the way a lawyer does. I watched him read a Postal Service form letter, and I watched him get to the address block, and I watched a careful man understand what he was holding about 1.5 seconds before anybody else in the room. He turned it over, and he read it out loud. All of it. The ink line at the top, asked Roseanne, says it's the church mail, and the date. And then he read the column, and he read every single one. And I have to tell you that a 65-year-old country lawyer reading March 2nd, nothing, 7 times, in a level voice, in a room with a window unit cycling, is the single loudest sound of my life. When he finished, he set it down flat and put 2 fingers on it, and he did not look at me. He looked at Roseanne. And he said the one honest sentence anybody said in that room, and he didn't say it for me. He said it because it was his problem. Mrs. Hepler, I drafted that provision. I asked him when he'd heard from her last, and you answered. Nobody said anything for a while. The window unit cycled off, which made it worse, and Camila very carefully set the roll of red flags down on the table like it had gotten heavy. She cried first. That's how it goes. And I'd been told it was coming, and it still worked on me for about 4 seconds, because it wasn't performance. Her chin went, and her hands went, and she was a 69-year-old woman coming apart in her attorney's conference room. She said I had no idea, none, what those last 2 years were. She said the word bathing. She said there were nights she slept in the recliner because of the stairs, all of which is true, and I sat there and let it be true. Then she moved, the way people do, from what she'd suffered to what I was. She said my father used to say my name like it hurt him. She said anybody at Pleasant Grove would tell me the same. She said she wasn't going to sit in this room and be told what a marriage looks like from the inside by somebody who wasn't in the house, and she turned to Byron when she said it, not to me, because I'd stopped being the audience about 90 seconds earlier and she knew it. And Byron Kilgore, who had not moved his fingers off that piece of paper, said, "Roseanne," just her name. That's all he said. And I watched a 13-year friendship between a country lawyer and a church woman end across 4 feet of laminate. She looked at Chad. That's the part I keep coming back to. Of all the people in that room, she looked at her son, and Chad, who had stood at that window with his arms crossed for 40 minutes, like a man guarding a door. Chad uncrossed his arms and looked at the carpet. And that's when she got to the floor of it. And then she got to the floor of it, and her voice came down and steadied and got almost reasonable, and she said, I was his wife. What came up that driveway was mine to sort. And the room went still, because she'd said it, and everybody heard her say it, including the notary, who had stopped peeling flags. I didn't get loud, not because I'm noble, because my hands were shaking, and loud was not available. I said, It was. That's what's on the table. And then I gave her the rest of it, and I used her own words, because they were good words, and she'd earned the right to have them said back to her correctly. I said, Showing up is the whole of it. You told me that at my kitchen table, and I believed you, and I still do. 41 letters showed up. Roseanne, every one of them showed up at the end of that driveway. You're the one who decided they didn't. She said my name. She said, Stacy. And I said the only thing I actually came there to ask. Where are they? Because I'd figured out something on the drive over that I hadn't let myself think about for 3 weeks. This is a woman who returns the wire hangers to the cleaners. Who keeps twist ties in a drawer with a rubber band around them? Who has never in her life thrown away a thing that still had a use in it? She didn't answer for a long time. Long enough that Chad said, Mom. And she said, to the table, They're in the hall closet. All of them. 41 letters. 11 years. In a plastic grocery sack on the shelf above the coats. Unopened. Every one. I stood up. I signed nothing that day. I picked my father's letter up off that table and folded it back along its own creases and put it in my coat, and I said, Thank you for the water, Mr. Kilgore. And I walked out and got into my truck and sat a long time holding the wheel with both hands before I could make myself turn the key. The rest of it went the way paperwork goes fast, and without any feeling in it at all. I never filed a contest. There were 9 days left on the clock, and I let them run out, and the reason wasn't grace. It was that I had what I came for, and a lawsuit would have cost me the only thing I had left, which was a clean read of my own father. What I did instead was ask for 1 paragraph. Byron Kilgore drafted it, and everybody signed it, and it went in the estate file with the rest of it, and it says, in the flat language those things are written in, that the recital regarding lack of contact was based on information that has since been shown to be incorrect, and that the decedent's daughter maintained written correspondence throughout the period in question. That's it. That's what I got. It's 4 lines in a folder in a courthouse basement, and it will never matter to one living soul except me. Roseanne kept the house and the 9.5 acres. She sold the ground the following spring. I'm told it went for $142,000. The letters came back to me in the plastic sack, driven over by Chad, who handed them to me at my own front door, and stood there a second and said, "I didn't know about any of that." And I said, "I know you didn't. And that's the whole relationship I have with my stepbrother, and it's fine. Pleasant Grove split the way churches do, which is to say quietly and permanently, and Roseanne still does the flowers. Buford Gaddy called me twice that winter for no reason at all, which is a 79-year-old farmer's entire vocabulary for, I'm sorry, and I understood him perfectly. I opened the letters over about 5 months, not in order, a few at a time, at the kitchen table, usually late, and I'll tell you what's in them, because it isn't what I expected. I expected to find myself getting colder. I did find that. But mostly what's in there is a woman telling her father about a barn cat with a broken pelvis, and about a boy learning to drive a stick, and about how the co-op changed hands, page after page of nothing. 11 years of a person handing somebody the small parts of a life on the assumption that he'd want them. I was kinder than I remembered being. That's the thing I got out of it that nobody could have given me. I'd spent 11 years thinking I'd been petty, and I sat at my table and read a stack of evidence that I had not been. And in the one from March of 2021, I found that I'd written out what I'd have pulled from the can that year. I'd pulled Drive to the Ocean again, and this time we'd actually go. He never read that. He wrote nothing on the back of a postal form 11 days before I mailed it. Both of those things are true, and I've stopped trying to make them fit together. They just sit in the same house now. It's been 14 months. The can is on top of my refrigerator, not framed, not on a shelf on top of the refrigerator, where a thing like that goes, where you have to reach for it. Elliot found out how it worked about a week after I brought it home, because he asked why there was a coffee can up there, and I told him. And he stood in my kitchen for a minute, and then went and got a pen and wrote something on the back of a receipt and dropped it in without showing me. He was 17 by then and too cool for approximately everything, and he did it anyway. There are 9 or 10 in there now. We take it down on March 2nd. Brock pretends this is normal. I don't have my father's house. I've got a coffee can and a bad photocopy of a will and 1 piece of Postal Service stationery with 7 pencil lines on the back of it, and that letter's in the fire safe in our closet with the birth certificates, which tells you where I rank it. I got a text from Roseanne in June. It said she'd been thinking about me, and that she hoped I knew she'd only ever done what she thought was best for him. I read it twice, and I put my phone face down on the counter, and I went out and finished what I was doing in the yard. I haven't answered it. I'm not going to. Some things you don't need to have the last word about you, just stop picking up the pen. I used to think that showing up was the whole of it, the way she said it. That love had to have a body in a chair or it didn't count, and that if you weren't in the room, you weren't really in the family. Now I know the room was never the thing. Everything I sent showed up. There was just somebody standing at the end of the driveway deciding what got carried the rest of the way. That's my story. A coffee can, 41 unopened letters, and 7 pencil lines that say nothing. So here's what I'd ask you to do today, and it's small and it costs about $1. If there's somebody you stopped writing to because they never wrote back, write 1 more. And put your phone number in it, printed, big enough for old eyes. And if you're the one who's far away from somebody who's getting older, call their doctor's office and their bank this week and ask to be added as a contact of record. It takes 1 phone call, and it means a second person gets told. If you know somebody who's been carrying a silence for years and calling it an answer, send them this one. They may have been getting answered the whole time. Tell me in the comments what you'd write in your 1 more letter. And hit subscribe if you want to sit with us again. That's all of it. Thank you for sitting with me on the porch tonight. I'll see you in the next one.